This pivot table, like some of the others we saw too, is on a separate sheet from the source data. And again, I think that's somewhat personal preference, but if there are times when you want to view the pivot table and the data on the same screen, you don't necessarily have to move the pivot table if it's on a separate sheet. I think some of you may know that you can, by way of the View tab in the ribbon, choose a new window and then come back to that same tab, the View tab, and choose Arrange All, and then perhaps choose, in this case, I'm going to choose Vertical. And for the moment, I've got two vertical windows. But on the left side here, for the moment, I'm seeing the same data twice in different zoom factors. But on the left side of the screen here, I'm going to show my source data. And maybe I don't need to see it too large. So what I could do is, for example, take the screen on the right and make it wider like this. And it's okay just to, if I'm going to be working with this pretty much, just leave the screen looking like that, because sometimes you might want to see the source data. I myself tend not to do that, but I think, again, that's personal preference. And there have been times when this came in handy, this ability to split the screen. You can be a little bit picky about it. I'm going to click over and make that narrower and all that, but you don't really have to go that far. Just by choosing these two commands from the View tab, you have to create a new window first. Sometimes people overlook that. And also, when you do an Arrange All, also be sure that the box Windows of Active Workbook is checked. And that means we're only talking about the current workbook. So I could have other workbooks open, of course, and I do, but in this case, that's what we want to make sure of. So we can go about our business here. Now, notice what happened there. It flipped sides. Whenever you make that choice, whatever sheet is active is going to be the one that will be on the left side. Now, again, you might say, who cares? But sometimes you do care. Anyway, we've got control over that. And sometimes that's a workaround, as if to say, you know, we don't really need to have all of our data visible at the same time. But when we do, this will help. So again, we can shrink it this way. Maybe I just want to see that much. And then on the left side, do this. Now, let's go back to some of the other things we were talking about here in the worksheet here called Sales by Date. And I'm going to make this full screen. And by the way, when you have two windows open, ideally you'll close the other window. Notice you'll see a :1 up in the title bar, but I'm simply going to maximize the screen here. And let's go back to this worksheet here, the one called Sales by Date. Now, earlier what I had done here was simply, in the pivot table fields list, brought in date as a rows label, a rows field right here. And a pivot chart, if it does exist here, is just worthless, and you can see it here. And let's move that out of the way. Now, I think one of Excel's greatest strengths is the ability to handle information by date and also by time. And let me scroll back just a little bit here. On this worksheet, we can see how, although the date is off to the left, the only source field we have related to date is naturally, in this case, just date. And when we put the date field here, we do see a sorted unique list, and that's helpful. But this is so deep, it's just not the ideal pivot table in terms of presentation, or even on the printed page, it's just not compact enough. But if we right-click any one of these dates, we do have a choice called Group. And we can group this by months. I'm going to do that right now. Just click OK. Notice also there are quarters and years, and above that, days, hours, minutes, seconds. So you can imagine all the different kinds of data here that you might want to be grouping on based on a time-related basis. So I'm going to group these by months simply by clicking OK right now. And as I zoom back, I think you can see the real value of this. Even the chart, although maybe not the greatest chart in the world right now, has some merit to it. Now, you'll notice something else. We did this once before in a different situation. Right now, as we look at this data, one thing that's a little bit off in terms of labeling is the fact that our months right here have the word date on top of them. Well, why don't we just change this to months? Just type right over it. And as we do that, you might have noticed that in the pivot table fields list, even though our source data still has data over in column D, you can still see that. But now this is called months here. And that's going to make it easier to work with. Now, zooming back a little bit and looking at the data, you can imagine how if we're covering information here for a 2-year period. Now, I do have 2 fields here on the rows label area. What I'd like to do is actually remove salesperson from this list and then make region be a columns area field. And then we've got a pivot table looking something like this. Now, just like that. And that's more compact for sure. Now, when I did this right click earlier, when there were dates there, I did the grouping by months. Let's come back and do a group again. And this time, how about quarters and years? In other words, and you don't have to use the control key on this, just click 1 or 2 or all 3 if you wish. Months, quarters, years. Click OK. And again, zooming back here. Now I'm going to shift the focus more toward the pivot table. So I scroll to the right here. And clicking back on the pivot table, we can see in our pivot tables fields layout here, years, quarters, and months. And this is a good opportunity to use the filters area as kind of a parking area. Nothing wrong with that display. In fact, it could be one of the situations. It looks great on a sheet of paper, and even for analysis. Again, there's always that line, we don't know where it is, that says it's either too much data or it's maybe just right, or maybe not enough. But nevertheless, what we can do here to simplify the display, if we somehow felt it was necessary, is maybe not show the months. So I'll move the months field into the filters area, and we're seeing the data like this. So it's not always that we're looking for the simpler view, but recognize how the value of this. Sometimes it's the compact view that we want. So we're seeing the breakout here by years, by region, and within each year by quarter, of course. Now, manipulating this again, and who knows how many different combinations here, we could probably figure it out, but you can imagine different combinations of years, quarters, and months. And I'm going to do something that might seem a little bit unorthodox. I'm going to put the years field below quarters in the pivot table fields list, and that means that on the display out here, years and quarters are going to be reversed. So I'll drag years below quarters like this, and now we see the data this way. Now, what's the advantage of that? The advantage could be we are seeing our 2 first quarter entries side by side, and sometimes you want to see that. And many times you'll hear first quarter sales a lot better than last year first quarter sales. We want to see them side by side, and simply by flipping the order of quarters and years, we can do that. And we can do the same thing with months. I'm going to move quarters out of the way, put it into the filters area. And again, remember, when you put a field in the filters area and do nothing with it, you essentially are ignoring it. I'm going to bring months down as a rows label, but I'm going to put it on top of years, which looks a little funny, and it's accentuated by the fact that we have subtotals. So let's get rid of the subtotals. Remember, we can add them when we wish. We can take them out when we wish. This is on the Design tab in the ribbon, leftmost button, Subtotals, do not show subtotals. And so now we've got a similar situation, this time with months instead of quarters. So what are we looking at here? This is the January data, 2012, 2013, together, side by side. You can do it this way too. Just by seeing that black arrow on the left side, you can click and see the data that way. So again, even though not every possible combination of these displays is going to be good, we're just seeing some ideas here on how you can manipulate this data, moving these fields, months, years, and quarters into different locations. And again, all we're really doing is getting maybe 1 or 2 of them out of the way at a time as we consider the display here. And there's nothing wrong or inappropriate necessarily about putting some of these date fields over in the columns area, even though I think at times it might look kind of strange. So if I put months, if I move it from the rows area into the columns area, like we're doing here, that looks a little strange maybe. Maybe if I bring region from its columns location into rows, we're seeing the data this way. Now, to me, that's not necessarily a great layout, but on the other hand, there's some merit to it. It could be acceptable. Maybe that would work a little bit better if we did quarters instead of months. So move months from quarters. So move months from the columns area into filters and quarters from filters into columns. We're seeing the data this way. Just different ways to display this. And again, the number of possibilities is not exactly overwhelming, but there's certainly lots of choices as we work with this. Now, there's something else we can do here too with this data. And let me remind you too, when all three of these fields are together, years, months, and then quarters, more typical display. Years, quarters, months would be the left to right logical order that I think most people would probably start with or go back to. But remember, in these situations, we've got two outer fields and one inner field. Now, you don't see those terms in the menu anywhere, but at the same time, it's a reminder we can collapse outer fields. If we don't want to see the detail for 2012, we either click the minus in front of it or double click 2012. And so we're only seeing the total for 2012 as we focus, for example, on 2013. Double click it again or click the plus. And we can do this with quarters as well too. Anytime we've got two or more fields in the same area, in other words, this is the rows area, we can collapse the outer fields. Collapsing quarter one, as I double click again, will collapse both of the quarter ones into a single row. So we've got these different needs at different times. And if somebody says, well, we don't really want to see the quarter one data at all, in other words, it's looking like this, we can use the drop arrow here and uncheck the box for quarter one. And now we're not seeing it at all. And our totals have been adjusted. It's 84.91. If I undo this with Control Z, now our total is 11.095. And so it's in sync. The data we're showing and what we're seeing here makes good sense. Now, the grouping by years, quarters, months, I think is something that's quite common. A couple of issues come up from time to time now that Excel can't handle quite so smoothly. And one could be, what if your quarter system is based on a fiscal year, like, for example, the federal government, where the first quarter starts in October? What you're going to have to do is add probably an additional column in your source data to come up with a calculation that indicates what quarter that is. And then use those quarters. Don't use the built-in term quarters. And you'll have to probably use a slight variation on the name. Call it QTR or just singular quarter, something like that, and it's likely to work. QTR would work for sure. I'm not sure about singular quarter, but we might have to put in a calculation to do that. And then the quarters we would see out here would be a little bit different. And then you're going to have to run into an issue of naming there. Do you call it FY quarter? That might be better. And how about the quarter of the last 3 months of the year that are actually in the next calendar year? So you have to think that out a little bit. It probably will mean additional entries in the source data if you'd like to accommodate a fiscal quarter system that does not begin in January. Here's another thought. If this has to do with sales, you can imagine maybe they've been tracking data for years here on a 2-week basis. What if instead of organizing the data by years, quarters, months, we were to group the data by days? So I'm going to right-click one of the months and go back to group and click months and quarters and years. So we're not going to be grouping by those, but then choose days. Now, this is what we saw before, but what I didn't point out before, and I will now, below this, you see an option, number of days. What if we change that to be 14? Now, this data covers a 2-year period from 2012 through 2013. And in 2012, Sunday was on the 1st. Now, to match up with calendars, physical calendars that we typically have on our walls here and there, a lot of people start reporting periods on Sunday. And so a weekly period is just one solid line across the calendar. 2-week period, of course, would be two rows across the calendar. So January 1st was a Sunday, so that would be a starting point. I don't recall right offhand the last date of any data that I have in here, but I'm just to play it safe, I'm going to put in the 31st here, 12/31 for my second entry here. So the starting at, ending at right here. And I'll simply click OK. So remember, we're on the path to removing months, quarters, and years, and now we're using days, and we see this information here. So that's a 2-year period. So it's covering, roughly 54 weeks. So we're seeing the data there, 57 rows. So that makes sense. And each of these is a 2-week period. So once again, a different display of the data. Meanwhile, the chart is still out there. We're not looking at it. It probably will be a bit too crowded. There it is right there. Again, even though pivot charts do have a role to play with certain kinds of pivot tables, there certainly will be times that they're just a bit crowded. And this is using a stacked column chart. That's the one I recommend if you want to stick with column charts. Now, other people might say, is there a trend here? And we can certainly do that. So remember, on a pivot chart, you can go to the Design tab in the ribbon, change the chart type, possibly line here, and the fourth option tends to work best, although sometimes the symbols might get in the way. Let's try that and see what it's looking at. Yeah, that looks like total chaos. I think, yeah. The problem here is that some of those, and you can see it, during some of the 2-week periods, there were no sales. For example, here's one right out here. So that's why we have this look. So I thought possibly that might have a decent, it might be a decent display, but I think not. So you're probably better off with a stacked column. Again, Design tab, change the chart type, or stacked row possibly sometimes too. The bar chart, I mean, that's the equivalent of a row. I doubt if this is going to look so good. Yeah. Now, if you made it taller, some merit there for saying, well, that 1-2 week period was pretty fabulous. Did something happen then? And we'll go back to the books and figure it out maybe. So different thoughts here on how to display not only dates and times, not only dates here by month and quarter and year as we did, but also by 2-week periods as we saw here too. Now, in a similar vein, we've got another worksheet here called Sales by Time. And this shows actual time of day. Now, here too, we might be interested, is there a certain hour of the day when sales are made? So it looks in this list that the hours could have been any time of day. Let's take a look at this. Let's create a pivot chart right. Let's create a pivot table right on the same sheet. So in this case too, it's about 400 rows. I'll double click the bottom edge of the cell there and then the top edge. And go to the Insert tab, Pivot Table, and Existing Worksheet, Location. I'll click on cell G1 and then OK. And let's show region as a columns area. We're going to track units. I'll simply click the box. That's a text field. It will automatically go to the values area. And then date, time, drag it right into rows. Or I could have checked it also. So these show dates and times. How about right-clicking here and going to group? But this time, not months, but hours. Let's uncheck months, but simply hours. And now we see a breakout there. And there's one odd entry there, and perhaps that's bad data. But we see, and actually it could be more than one entry. Looks like it, 11 p.m. So something's a little bit strange with our source data, and that probably isn't a great choice there for that. I'm going to press Alt F1 too to see if anything jumps out at us. You can see ahead of time that the 10 a.m. hour was the busiest. So I'm going to press Alt F1. Doesn't come out so clearly here unless we go to the Design tab and change the chart type to be stacked column. That's the second of the column choices. And there we are, much better. And again, there is that oddity with data. Now, either I didn't check out my data recently enough to figure out what's going on, or that's a typo in there. And you can't really sort by time within date here unless we create a new field. So I'm going to ignore that. I've got another sheet over here, sales by date time, and this has the time as a separate field. And this example might work a little bit better. A similar example has a slightly different kind of data, but it does have about the same number of rows. So once again, insert, pivot table, existing worksheet, location, H1 this time, just click that, click OK. And first thing I'll do here is bring in time as the very first field. It will automatically go to a rows label area, and then units, you can check that or drag it, and we'll do this by region. And we see this breakout, but once again, it would make sense, group this by time. Group this by hours, there we go, and not months. And once again, we could press Alt F1 to get a pivot chart, and Design tab, change chart type, stacked column. And here we can see clearly it's the 3 p.m. And of course, you can see that in the data too, as you look at it there. So different ways to group the data here. Now, another thought here too, if I go back and change the grouping here to minutes and not hours, we'd have the information this way. I doubt if you'd want to pursue that. Now, with certain kinds of data, this could be appropriate. I think in this case it wouldn't be. But if you have certain kinds of data where maybe calls come in and there's a cluster of them around the hour, this could verify that impression or that thought. If you do this by minute, most of the time I think that's an unlikely choice there. But we could go back here though, once again, do the group. Now, if we put in hours and minutes together, this gives us another option here. We can see the breakout by minute each of these hours too. So there's just tons of things to pursue here in terms of the grouping capability here. Now, I want to go back to a worksheet we'd worked with before to bring out another issue here. We've talked about slicers a little bit, but we haven't really seen them. And also there's a new feature called timeline. Let's go back to a worksheet that we were working with earlier, sales by category. And we had created a pivot table from this on another sheet. There it is right there. Now, in this particular pivot table, we're showing data by sales type, clothing, and region. And we showed different ways of having the subtotals appear and not appear. But sometimes you run into this issue of what if we only wanted to show some of the data? And what I'm about to show you by way of slicers is this idea that even though we've got filter type arrows here, we can narrow down our list. We have them over here for region. We run into this issue of what happens when we're showing some of the regions. Do we remember the others? Now, with only 5 regions, you and perhaps most of or some of your audience would know what's not being shown. But for example here, if we're showing just Northeast and Midwest, do you remember the 3 that are not being shown? Now, sometimes you say, well, we don't care anyway. But again, we're struck with that concept or that idea that we're not being reminded of what's not visible. Same thing with the clothing type. With only 5, you'd probably remember most of them. The presenter certainly would. But on the other hand, what if there were 10 clothing types, 10 regions or more in different cases here? The filter idea, as good as it is, does have that missing element to it. So, introduced in Excel 2010, the slicers concept is available when the active cell is within the pivot table. And starting in 2013, as I've mentioned, slicers are going to be available in other tables. In other words, they're not pivot tables, they're simply tables. On the Analyze tab in the ribbon, Insert Slicer. Now, perhaps overkill, but I'm going to put in a slicer for clothing type, region, year, quarter, and sales type, and then click OK. Now, if you were making a presentation, what I just did, you'd probably want to do ahead of time. In this case, I do want to show you how it works. So one by one, I'm going to take these and shrink them a bit to make them only as wide or as deep as they need to be. Eventually, we could use different colors on that if we wanted to. Something like this. And you're going to be hard pressed for space sometimes. That's a slight downside to these. And you can move these around in any way you want. And already I think you can see from the visual, although we haven't used them just yet, you can begin to see that these are pretty large, and they will give us a pretty good visual of what's going on. And I usually resize them so there are no scroll bars in there. It just looks a little neater, a little tidier, and that sort of thing. So you got to, spend a little bit of time with them, and probably during a presentation, you don't want to see people to be bored unless you've got something really interesting to say along the way. Now, as I do this too, there could be a chart in the background. I don't want that to be a distraction, but at the same time, I might want to point out from time to time that it could be useful. Okay, we're looking at the data here. And we've got these slicers off to the right. I'll have to zoom back just a little bit here so we can see this. And then move over. And then move these around. Now, the other thing too is I clicked outside of the pivot table. Therefore, the pivot table field list for the moment is not visible. And that's okay because sometimes we don't need to see that. Okay, so maybe you're making a presentation. Maybe you're with just your manager who says, can we see retail only? I'll click retail in this slicer right here. And what are we seeing? Simply retail. Now, we may or may not be seeing a retail total. That's a different issue. Design tab, maybe we don't want to see them. That's okay. Let's view wholesale instead. So instead of 4.4 million, I'm going to click wholesale. If we don't want sales type to be a filter at all, we'll simply clear the filter. That's the button up here, clear filter. In other words, do not filter by sales type. Show all sales type. Let's just look at 2012. 3.15 million. 2013, 3.11. Let's clear the filter. Now, what's different here? Sales type is currently a field that's within the pivot table. Off to the right, pivot tables fields list, you can see sales type is there. Year is not being used in the pivot table, and yet with slicers, we can say, as we wish, 2012 or 2013. And how about regions? For the moment, we're looking at all the regions, and it is a pivot table field. What if somebody says, let's only look at the Northeast and the Midwest? So we'll click Northeast, and for the moment, we are only seeing Northeast totals. And in the pivot table, you can see clearly that we see Northeast. But how do we add Midwest? Hold down the Control key, click Midwest in the slicer. Now, is there any doubt as about what we are seeing and what we are not seeing? So as we look at this, again, recognize this dual role now that we have with presentation, because we've got slicers that show us what is being shown and what's not being shown. And if we click within the pivot table, perhaps we are reminded of which fields are in the pivot table. The pivot table right now, in terms of the row and columns areas, is showing region, sales type, and clothing type. And we see slicers for those. In other words, these three: region, sales type, and clothing type. Put them sort of together. The other two fields, quarter and year, are not within the pivot table. And yet with the slicer concept, we still can use them to show the data. Now, with certain kinds of people, maybe certain managers who don't know pivot tables that well, but yet on the other hand, would like to get these quick totals or have them at their fingertips, they could easily pick up and learn the idea here. All you've got to do is click the ones you want and use the Control key occasionally to get the totals that are most pertinent to you. So maybe a particular manager who has something to do with belts and ties and shoes maybe says, okay, I want to see belts, ties. Click that with the Control key. Let's click shoes. Let's do this for all regions. Here's the filter for regions. Click the clear filter button. Let's focus just on retail. There we go. And from time to time, recognize too, depending on the placement of these, how you have to move them around. So you just can't always predict what you're going to be doing with them. So I'm moving these to the right now and probably won't move them again, but still recognize what we can do there. So let's add dresses to the mix here. Use the Control key, dresses. And somebody else comes along and says, okay, could we take Northeast out of the mix here? Hold down Control, we'll click Northeast, that deselects it. So at different times you've got control. Remember what I'd said earlier about the deficiency of filtering in general is you are not reminded of what is not being shown. And sometimes that's really important because it makes you think like, why isn't it being shown? Or should I show it? Or I don't want to see it, and all those different angles that we approach this with. So even though this you have to kind of work with this a little bit, I'd say rehearse it if you're going to make a presentation. Think of the placement of these. To spiff it up a little bit, I'm going to click on clothing type right here. And notice that it has its own contextual tab in the ribbon called Slicer Tools. The tab is Options. I want this one to be sort of a sort of a reddish or pink. This one here will be green. I'm just picking the choices that I see up there. Year, I'll make this color. Sales type, this one, and region, this one. And there are a few more up there too if you somehow ran out of what you thought were great choices. Yeah, the more solid colors are at the bottom. So different thoughts here. Obviously, this is not the most important thing, although sometimes people get carried away with it. So we can see clearly what's going on here. And once you become familiar with this, I think it will change the way you think about pivot tables and how the data is being displayed. Earlier, I mentioned too how we can now use these in worksheets that are tables but not pivot tables. So this is a table. It's got its own design tab. It says Table Tools, its own contextual ribbon, as we say sometimes. Click the Design tab. Some people get way too carried away about the banded rows, banded columns, but you've got those options. For many people, the choice of using a table is more about the visuals than it is about content, but ultimately you'll begin to see that it can be about content too. And there are things about it that we don't want to go into necessarily, but at least recognize that there are some great features associated with tables. And now, giving added impetus to that idea, why would I ever, or the question comes up, why would I ever convert my data to a table? Because now you can use slicers with a table. So imagine you've got a ton of data here. Maybe you're making a presentation, possibly you've hidden a few columns to simplify it a little bit, and then you decide to add some slicers. So Insert tab if you're working with regular data here, and Slicer right there. So I'm only going to do a couple in the example here. Department, which has a lot of entries, and Status for now. Click OK. Now, Department has about 25 entries, and so this is going to be really deep unless you recognize that in the context-sensitive options tab here, we've got a choice called columns. So we could make this be 3 columns. Now, we still might be hard-pressed for space here because some of them have long names. So you're just going to have to decide. Maybe as I'm looking at this, I'm saying, the birth date, hire date for the moment isn't important. So let's hide those two. And now we've got our slicer out there. And again, I think it's best so you don't have to scroll, but still, you might have to in some situations. And here's the one for status. So you're saying, let's only look at the full-time people. Let's click full-time. That's all we're seeing. Let's focus just on our training groups. Here's admin training. There's one. And with the control key, we'll click executive education. And then we got another one here called professional training group. And again, recognize that we still don't necessarily have enough space here unless we make these wider to see the entire names of some of these departments. So you have to think that out a little bit regarding how that's going to appear. And you can customize those too if you wish to. But recognize that we cannot do this until Excel 2013 for tables. We can do these starting with Excel 2010. We can use these with pivot tables. So slicers introduced in Excel 2010 at the moment only for pivot tables, and in 2013 now they are available with other data that's been converted into tables. So going back to this example again, and again, recognize the interplay between your use of slicers and the pivot tables fields list. In a certain sense, you could say, now this would be the ultimate probably in being ridiculous, but if I move momentarily the different fields from the rows area into filters and from columns into filters, we're just left with a grand total. And look what the filters over there look what the filter on the left side is not really doing for us. All we can say is that's retail, but we don't know what's being shown at all. And what's really being shown are clothing types. We're seeing 3 clothing types, only first quarter, both years, retail, and all regions but Northeast. So let's bring back all the regions. Now notice that the pivot table is not expanding, but we're getting different totals. Let's bring back all the clothing types, all the sales types. Years are already there, and all the quarters. So there's a total of 6.3 million. Let's only focus on 2012. It's 3.155 million. Now, of course, this is a little bit extreme. We probably wouldn't really do this, but nevertheless, you can see the totals this way. Click within the pivot table, and that's only these few cells here, and we're reminded at the moment that our pivot table fields, of course, are all in the filters area. So a lot of potential creativity as you work with these, but on the other hand, I think the focus for a lot of people is on this idea of, I'm showing what I want to show, and all along we've got a clear idea of the possible choices, including, of course, the ones we are not currently looking at, the ones we haven't chosen for the current display. So I think it's ultimately a great tool. It's a huge improvement to the way we work with data now, and filtering. It takes on a new dimension with these slicers. Now, this data covers a 2-year period. And in this example here too, the source data, which is here, we see data by sales, by year, by quarter. We also have a new feature here called Timeline. Timeline, introduced in Excel 2013. Active cells within the pivot table. Analyze, insert timeline. Use a timeline to filter dates interactively. Timelines make it faster and easier to select time periods, etc. That's the pop-up tip. Now, notice what it says here. We can't create a timeline for this report because it doesn't have a field formatted as date. That's a limitation. So our source data, let me jump back to it here, simply has year, it has quarter, but it doesn't have a date field. In this worksheet here, the one that we were working with earlier to show you data, and we grouped it by month, we grouped it by quarter, by year, and also by 2-week periods here. Let's introduce a timeline here. And possibly this is going to look a little bit better if we shove this data down. So what I'm going to do is highlight those cells, right-click and insert, and simply shift the cells down. All right, the active cells within the data, we do have a date field in this data. That's the source data off to the left in column D. So clicking within the pivot table, Analyze tab, Insert Timeline. Now, because I renamed it, it says months now. The source data itself has date, but if you recall earlier, I'd renamed this months. Let me cancel this for the moment. Now, I can either change this to date or date that to match up with the fact that column D has that. That's not a requirement. I could call it 2-week period, which might make more sense. But to make the timeline wording a little bit better, I'm going to type in date here. Again, I'm saying that's not a requirement. But let's jump back into the Analyze tab, Insert Timeline. It says date, click OK. Now, the timeline, you want to experiment with it. I'm going to make it wider here. Gives us the option in this example right now of grouping the data by months. Here's the option. The data covers a 2-year period. Maybe we're just interested in July to July. So we could start right here, for example. And we're saying only July of 2012. How about the last half of the year, for example? Something like that. Now, and based on the timeline, and once again, what I'm going to do here, even though you can shrink the timeline this way, I think that's not good because of what happens to the display of it. I'm going to take this data and just kind of push it down a little bit again. Actually, the easiest way to do this might be just make row 1 taller, something like that. Then come back here, make this a bit bigger. That way. So this allows us to do a consecutive set. If we wanted to do that middle 6 months, we do it this way. Many times you'll have to make the timeline wider so you can see everything. You'll notice other months. We could do this by quarters here too. We just want to show a consecutive set of quarters. First, second, and third quarter. Now, because my pivot table is not that compact, I'm going to change a little bit. We're not seeing the totals at the time we're seeing the timeline. So as with slicers and with charts, you do run into these situations where you're going to have to do some creative realignment of the data. And particularly if you're presenting this before a live audience, you will have wanted to have rehearsed this idea here ahead of time as you're presenting the information. So I want to click back within the pivot table itself and group the data as I had before by months, quarters, years, uncheck days, and then make a quick adjustment to make the pivot table here a little bit more compact. Actually, I'll leave it there for the moment because, first of all, recognize that within the pivot table, we're only seeing 2013, quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, because that's what we've chosen in the timeline. So I'm going to change the timeline here to include quarter four. Watch the pivot table below it. Let's see what's happening. Now, what if I were within the pivot table here to say I only want to see quarters 1, 2, and 3. In other words, not quarter 4. Keep an eye on the pivot table. And then what happened? The timeline reacted by, well, first of all, on the pivot table, we're saying, let's not show fourth quarter, but we're still showing 2013. So the timeline is now showing us up above all quarters. So within the pivot table, I'm going to click the drop arrow for years so that we're not seeing 2013. Watch the timeline up above. Now, that can get a little confusing, can't it? What kind of data are we looking at here? In other words, do we control this by way of the timeline? So I'm going to show the data this way. 2013 only. Or what if I want to do 2012 only? I mean, first of all, look at the pivot table below. We're showing 2013 only. Now, by using timeline, we're doing 2012 only, and then the pivot table reacts by showing us only 2012. So you need to experiment with that to see how they work together. Notice also on the right side of the timeline, we could just show years that way. And apparently within the data, maybe I haven't checked it out recently, we might have one date in 2014. So I'm going to click out in column D and do a descending sort from the data tab, ZA. Now, it doesn't show 2014, so I'm a little bit perplexed as to why that would actually be there within the list, since we have no data there. And right now we're showing 2014. So the more conventional use of this, I think in this case, probably would be by quarters or months. Now, we could do this by days. I think you'd see here, that's not exactly the most useful thing. And as we do this too, let me recognize here, we could be looking at just a consecutive set of days. Let me regroup this by switching quickly to months and then back again. We only want to show the data, let's say, for the time frame here by years. We're looking at 2013 by years. How about by quarters? And maybe we only want to look at certain quarters. Let's just focus on the first quarter of 2013. So that's what we're seeing in the pivot table. If we then switch from quarters to months, we've got our 3 months, January, February, March. Let's just focus on January. And then maybe switch to days. Now, this is not a scenario that you always must go through, but what I'm pointing out is the different ways that we can do the grouping. So within January, maybe we only want to focus on the first 7 days, and we're seeing what's happened there. Now, within the pivot table itself at different times, you might be displaying the data differently. That 58 total that we're seeing represents our total for the first, actually 8 days, now 7 days. 19, the first 7 days in January of 2013. But in our display here, we're showing years, quarters, and date. So again, I think you can see, I'm not trying to create confusion by all this, but recognize that the timeline has a role to play, and you just need to experiment with it, whether it's going to be years, quarters, months. It depends upon the extent of the data, of course. But in some cases, it might be days only. If you've only got data for, say, a 6-month period and you want to focus on this week or that week, you want to choose the days option as you work with timeline. So it's a new tool available initially in Excel 2013. If you're using Excel 2007 or Excel 2010, it is not available. Now, we've done grouping by date. You can also do grouping in what we might call an ad hoc way. I want to go back to a worksheet we had seen earlier. The appliance sales, we had created a pivot table from this. Here it is on the sheet to the left of it. And I want to change the display of this to have region as a column label and not product. So the question has come up, can we group this data in almost any way we want? Someone has asked the question already, how well have we done in the East? We don't have an East here. We do have a Northeast, we got a Southeast, we got two columns here. They're not adjacent to one another, but let's move them together. Now remember, if you want to move a column like this, you need not highlight it all. Simply click its label. In this case, point to the lower edge, drag it leftward. Let's highlight both of these. Right click and group. Now suddenly we see this term group 1. Let's rename that and call it East. Just type right over it, East. Notice it's got a minus in front of it. We can collapse East. Now looking ahead, you can see ahead. You can almost probably can do the math in your head. 2005, 2107, those are actual values there. So we're going to get what? 4112 by collapsing. There it is. So we are seeing a brand new total here. We've never seen it. You could say we've never seen it before. That's our Eastern total. We'd probably want to do the same thing here for the two Western regions. Highlight both of those, right click and group. And we could collapse that as well too. But here too, we'd probably name that West. And we can collapse that. Now, recognizing the pivot table fields list, we now have a new field called Region 2. That's the wording we're seeing right here. That's not a great name either. I guess I could just call it East-West. There we are. So we can see what's happening there. East-West. Now, what if in the pivot table fields list, what if I remove region? In other words, I'll just momentarily make it a filter, drag it into the filters area. So now we've got a pivot table, and you could once again say, this is brand new data. We've never seen that kind of a breakout before. We're looking at East and West. And for the moment, we can't expand this into our Northeast and Southeast because that field, I put it in the report filters area. But if we wanted to see that breakout along with the East-West breakout, we drag region again into columns this way. And only by clicking the plus or double clicking do we see the breakout again. So I think you can begin to imagine creative uses of that too. Here's another thought. Maybe these people here work in different cities. And Dave Moss here works with Bill Babowski. So I'm going to just click there and drag this upward. Now, as I do, all the data is going to go with it. So Bill and Dave and Mary down here, they all work in the Eastern office. So I'm going to take their names here, and just as soon as we see there, put them together. So these three work in the Eastern office. Let's highlight their names. Right click and group. And I'll just call it Eastern or Eastern office, whatever. And without doing all these, I think you begin to say maybe these. I'll just because. I know they're alphabetical, but just imagine for the sake of argument here, these three people work in our Chicago office. We call it the central office. So right click there and group. There we go. Central office. And then these people here work in the Western office. So that gives our data a whole new breakout too. And by the way, I didn't mean to confuse it in this sense. East and West happen to refer to the regions where the sales were made. So maybe these people, although they work in the Eastern office, can make sales anywhere in the United States. And these people here, even though they're in the central office, they can make sales in East, West, South, whatever, different regions. So I didn't mean to confuse it in that sense. But we can do grouping with these fields here, as we saw. Remember here too, what we might want to do in some cases, Here I'd certainly put in sales office or location or something like that. There we go. So if we didn't want salesperson here, I'll simply drag this from the rows area into filters, and we won't see their names right now. And there certainly could be times when you want to do that, or bring them back at other times too. And reversing the order there probably, well, not as good. Most people would agree. But it gives us new insight into the data too, if we can do these groupings like this. And you can do them, as I said, on an ad hoc basis, as I did that here. In other words, out of nowhere, so to speak. I just want to group these fields. Well, now, something else we can do with our data too is sometimes we need to add additional data, or we want additional information to come from the pivot table. So what I'm going to do here is essentially undo this, and actually not really undo it, but simply move fields around to create a slightly simpler display like we'd seen earlier. Salesperson region, and move the other fields temporarily into filters area. I think you can begin to see at different times, if you are in a dynamic presentation mode, if you want those fields to be available so you can quickly bring them back into the mix, putting them in the filters area sometimes makes sense. This is more than what you would typically see, but nevertheless, they are there. Now, let's imagine that we want to show this data differently. Right now, we're simply showing totals. So as we look at the data here, a couple things. We might want to have some of the numbers stand out for whatever reason. And when you click within the data, you can go to the Home tab in the ribbon and choose Conditional Formatting. And if the active cell is within a pivot table, what you want to move on to is the choice here called New Rule. And recognize the option here. Apply rule to all cells showing sum of items, all cells showing sum of items for salesperson and region. So here we have salesperson and region. And the format styles we can use here are based on your knowledge, and you might not be too familiar with conditional formatting, but we could use a 2-color scale, a 3-color scale, data bars, icon sets. Let's try icon sets. Now, if you have not seen these, you're in for a big surprise and hopefully some enlightenment, because these are pretty amazing tools. Let's say we divide the data. We'll start by using a 3-part icon, a 3-part icon split. Now, as you might imagine, Excel is going to split the data into thirds based on 33 and 67%. Now, what we're about to see here doesn't mean that we're going to see an equal number of red, yellow, and green dots. What we're going to see, and you'll see it momentarily here, we only see, it looks like 4 dots. Now that's obviously not a third of all the dots here. By the way, these are officially referred to as traffic light patterns. These are unrimmed, and believe it or not, they've got rimmed as well. Nevertheless, these three, the greens that we're seeing, I'm highlighting them manually here. Here are the greens. Now, this doesn't represent 1/3 of the data, but if you were to analyze the numbers there and divide the numbers into thirds, these are the only ones in the top third. So you could say those are the top performers. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. You're manipulating the pivot table. I'm going to put region. I'm going to move it from columns to rows. The data this way. Maybe bring in or move customer into columns. And we're seeing this. Now we're kind of hard pressed to describe what these are really meaning. We're seeing them in the grand totals there. And you can see the greens are still the highest and the reds are the lowest, but it's got a different meaning. And so out of all of our grand total entries, there's we've got two people did, or the two, we've got 3 high ones in the Northeast and 2 in the Southeast and so on. So it starts to get a little complicated as to what this really means at this point. Now, if I move region from rows into columns, and then I'll move customer out of the mix again, we're looking at this display. Let me flip these to region and salesperson. Pivot the data, as we sometimes say. Everything there should make sense. That's not the best display, of course, but we're in the same situation. We now have our 4 green traffic lights the way we saw them before. Now, what if I move salesperson out of the mix and put it into filters? We don't see any dots at all. I can bring customers back in. We're not seeing these. Have we lost them? What if I move region out of the mix too? Put customer here. Sales office over there. What happened to these? Are they gone? Well, earlier when we saw these, it was region and salesperson. Let's bring salesperson back over there. How about region down here? So the 2 fields that we had when we established these traffic lights were region and salesperson. And because they're in columns, one's in a columns area, one's in the rows area right now. Because of that, we are seeing the dots. To make this simpler, I'll move out sales office and move out customer. Now, what if I remove region completely from the pivot table? In other words, it's still a field, of course. I'll uncheck the box for region. Move salesperson over here. Now I changed my mind. I want region to be a columns area field. I'll drag it into here. What happened? We lost our traffic light pattern. So if you take any of the fields that are involved when you initially set up conditional formatting, if you take them out of the pivot table fields area, in other words, if you remove them from columns, filters, or rows, in other words, if they're not here at all, then you lose that combination that we saw. So we've got region and salesperson back again. We could resurrect that display if we wanted to, but because I moved salesperson out of here completely, or region out of here completely, it's making a difference which one, then we can't automatically have that reappear. So let me repeat this in a slightly different way. Let's say we do this with region and product. And we can have that in a number of different ways. And I'll use a different display this time too. Conditional formatting, new rule. All cells showing sum of items for product and region. And by saying product and region, it's as if we're saying only when those 2 fields are present in the columns and rows area are we going to see this feature. So format style right here, pick the one we want. Now, if you want to choose colors, I'll show you what that looks like. I don't think it's the best choice, but we could use a 2-color scale. And we see the red here. If we don't like the color, we can pick different colors, of course. That's going to be a sliding scale. And I don't think that's as good. So I'll click OK just to show you that. You can see what's happening. So the higher numbers are the lighter ones. The lower numbers are the darker ones. That has some merit, perhaps, in different situations. I'm going to go back again. Conditional formatting. This time, since we don't want to create a new rule, we might just want to change the existing rule. It's called manage rules. There we are that way. So we edit the rule. We want to change this. Instead of a 2-color scale, we could use 3-color. How about data bars? We could do those too. We can shade the data this way. I'll show you what this looks like. That's another option. Not my favorite either, but again, you want to experiment with this, of course. Come back. Let's manage the rules again. I prefer the icons myself. Let's edit the rule. Another way to break these out can be with different icon sets, and there's quite a few of them there. Not only 3, but 4s and 5s. So you can split that into 4ths or 5ths, that idea. There's a 4 level. You can also, and I doubt if you want to do this, you can also change the numbers there. So when you're doing a 4-way split, the breakpoints are at 25, 50, and 75%. But yeah, I'm going to stick with the standard here and do it this way. Okay, so once again, we see what's happening. Blacks are the lowest in this case because of our traffic light. Greens are the best, and yellows and reds in between. So as long as we keep region and product in one of these 3 areas here, we will be able to at least get these back. Let me clear out the filters area completely so this is easier to see. And by the way, you can drag fields off of here. I'll do it this way.
Okay, if I move region from columns into filters, watch the pivot table. If I bring in customer, makes no change to the pivot table. So why are we not seeing the traffic lights? One of our fields is in the filters area. So if I bring region into the columns area, now we're seeing these. If I move region into the rows area, we're still seeing these. Move customer out of the mix by putting it into filters, see what's happening. If I move region into filters, you can see the different combinations here. Region down into rows, the product out of the way. Bring product back, move region out. So when region and product are both here, it makes no difference whether we have others or not. We will see these. Now, once again, just a reminder: if we remove either region or product from our from the lower portion here, in other words, we take it out of the pivot table, then that means we can't instantly recreate it by dragging it back in. So if I uncheck the box for region or product, I'll just pick region, uncheck it. We lost our traffic lights. If I bring region back, we don't have our traffic lights again. We have to bring back the conditional rule. But there's no question, I think you can see how there's real merit to that and how we could be using that in a very effective way. And keep in mind too, it's with more fields here. I'll do it one more time in a different way. Again, we've got region, product. I want to break out by region, salesperson, product, this way. Actually, maybe. Into the pivot table, conditional formatting, new rule, all the cells showing salesperson and product. Now, let me back out there for a second. Notice it's only picking up salesperson and product, not region. Leave region out there momentarily. There we go. Conditional formatting, new rule. All cells showing sum of items for salesperson and product. How about the 3-color scale? There we go. And we see the display this way. If you've used this outside of pivot table, perhaps you've got some familiarity with it, you begin to recognize that a common pattern that's being used is the so-called traffic light colors. And so we tend to think that red lights are not acceptable. So the darker reds here are the low numbers. There's a 30, there's a 57, there's a 65, 60, and so on. And the greens, and as we move toward green. So this is actually a color progression as we move toward the darker greens. So from the reds into oranges, into not exactly pink, but then into pale yellow and so on. You see how this is progressing toward the greens. And again, it's just another feature to give us more visual power as we work with pivot tables. Now, another way to display the data, I'm going to take off the color only because I think it's a bit of a distraction here. But what if we somehow wanted to bring out the idea of how some of our salesperson might be doing better with some products than with others? We see the numbers, and the conditional formatting could have helped there. But what if we could somehow display the numbers differently? I'm going to right-click one of these and choose Value Field Settings. Show values as. Right now, no calculation. How about percent of column total, percent of row total? Let's do percent of row total first. Percent of row total. Number format. I'm going to change this so that we only have a single decimal instead of 2. Click OK. And OK. And I might even consider having no decimals. Depends on the numbers. Looks like a fairly even display, but on the other hand, we're focusing for the moment. Here's Bill Bobowski. These numbers here add up to 100%. You can see that, by the way, in the status bar at the bottom of the screen. They add up to 100%. So Bill's manager may be saying,
you didn't do so well with clothes washers compared with the others, at least percentage-wise. So you might look into that. Or Betty here, only 9% of your sales were dishwashers. So you can begin to see as you look around here. Because this is sample data and kind of made up, a lot of these don't jump out at us, but on a person-by-person basis, they might. Now, just as easily, we could have chosen, I'll go back by right-clicking the value field settings. We can also choose show values as, or instead of this, percent of column total. I think this will be less interesting, but unless a number jumps out at us. And now we're seeing the data where these numbers, for example, add up to 100%. So because we're crossing the threshold of 10%, a lot of these, the numbers stand out just a little bit differently because of ease of reading, for example. So 18% of all the refrigerators. Now remember, there are 12 people, and he sold about a fifth of all the refrigerators. So he's got a special knack for refrigerators or something. Now remember, these numbers here don't add up to 100%. So it's different that way. But they add up to 100% this way. So once again, you begin to see some insight about what's happening here. Willy Loman is our best performer, so you can see in the grand total column that he's got a higher percentage than the others. So if you're a statistician, if you're an analyst, the wheels are clicking here. You know what you're looking for, and there are lots of options. I would encourage you to explore some others here too. As you right-click and go to value field settings, show values as. So we just saw percent of column total, percent of row total. There are a lot of other choices here too as we scroll downward. Difference from, percent of difference from. Willy Loman is our best performer. Let's compare some of these other people here to see how poorly they are underperforming him. Now, I'm not a negative person, but maybe that's the way it might sound if we do this. We're going to compare this with Willy Loman. Everybody's going to be compared with Willy Loman, so his row is going to be empty. So now these are all negatives. This could be a point too, or we could also, by highlighting the data here to make these negatives stand out, go to conditional formatting, set up a new rule, and actually use a formula to determine which cells to format. So I'm simply going to say format cells where this formula is true. I'm just going to put in less than 0. Now, possibly, let's try it this way first. Format here. If they're less than 0, I'll fill this with with an orange color. 10. Now, that didn't work because what I forgot to do there was simply to apply the actual address. So we can manage this rule. Come in here again, edit the rule, and we need to say here, equal, the active cell is in B9. Now, what I did do differently this time too is I did highlight all those cells. So if B9 is less than 0, that will act as a substitute for all the others. And actually what I want to put in here maybe is those that are greater than 0 to see if anybody has exceeded Willy Loman in any case here. And there will be a couple of examples of that probably. So I see that. So in only 4 situations here, based on salesperson and item, has someone outperformed Willy Loman. In this case, big time, 20%, 21%. But you see all the others there are negatives. So everybody's underperforming Willy, who's our top performer there. So once again, you can begin to see this can go on and on and on in terms of your analytical capability here as we work with this data. Now, Excel also has a capability by way of pivot tables of bringing together data from different sources. And I want to switch to a different workbook here. In this workbook, here's a sheet called East. Now, let me zoom on these. In the East, and this, for the sake of example, you can imagine, here's a store that only sells, or let's say in the East, for the moment, we're only selling couches, tables, and desks. Or better yet, let's say that's what we're trying to get a beat on. Couches, tables, and desks. That's all we sell in our through our various methods here. We've got some retailers here. We have wholesale sales. We've got some online sales. Now, as I switch to Midwest, remember, this is couches, tables, desks. Here we're seeing couches, desks, no tables, but we're seeing chairs and bookcases. And what I'm getting at, we've got different sheets here. Now we're also showing, I'll jump back to East here. The way we sell these online wholesale, Electrocity, micro stuff, well, there's online, there's wholesale, but there's Electrocity, but in other words, they're different. We go to the South, it's different. In other words, we're seeing some of the same terms, but they are overlapping. And here's West, which is selling more items and through various methods too. So even though these are not identical, we can pull these together by way of a pivot table. If they were identical in terms of their layout, it would be even simpler and perhaps more logical, but we can pull this data together here. Again, here's a quick look: East, Midwest, South, West. So I've got an empty sheet here. I've just called it consolidated pivot table. Let's consolidate this data. Now here's something very strange. In Excel 2003, it's been a while, in Excel 2003, there is a feature called the Pivot Table Wizard with the button for consolidating data. We don't have that button available in 2013 unless we take a special action. And here's what we need to do. And this seems a little strange. We need to be using the quick access toolbar. Now, most people keep this above the ribbon, possibly it's below. But the last button to the right, we can click it, Customize Quick Access Toolbar. And the very last choice there is More Commands. Let's click it. In this dialog box, we have an option here. It says Popular Commands, about 30 choices. There's another choice called Commands Not in the Ribbon. It's a much bigger list, about 300 or so. We're looking for a choice out of the past, you might say, Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard. Now, I'm not sure what Microsoft's thinking is on this, but this was available in the past, and it's here for compatibility reasons. But I'm looking for a replacement feature in Excel 2013 that isn't there yet for this. But what we can do once we find this is click Add. It's now going to be in our Quick Access toolbar, Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard. So let's click OK. There's the button, Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard. Click it. And what we want to do is use multiple consolidation ranges. The question above it, where is the data that you want to analyze? Multiple consolidation ranges. Then click Next. I usually go with the defaults here, create a single page field for me, click Next. Now what we have to do one by one is accumulate these ranges. So the box there says range. I'm going to click on the East sheet. And for ease of use, what I've done here is made the relevant cells yellow. Now, I don't really have to move this out of the way, but I will. I'm going to highlight the yellow cells. The dialog box collapses automatically. So, and then I'll click Add. So we've added those. Now I'm going to click on the Midwest sheet and go out and highlight. Notice it's a bigger set of cells here, a larger range. Highlight that and add. And then go to the South sheet, same general idea. Highlight just those yellow cells, add. And then the West sheet. Highlight these and add. And then next, and I'm going to put it on this worksheet. I'll put it in cell A1 and finish. Now, it's a pivot table. It needs a little bit of work, though, but nevertheless, it's working. We've got a grand total of 63,000. Now, what I could have done, we can do it kind of quickly here. If I go to the West sheet, just roughly in head, almost 20,000, and the South is 13, so that's about 33,000. Midwest, another 19, so we're up to 52,000, and then East, another 12 almost, so 64,000 almost. So that's what we got. So we're at least in the ballpark, as they say. That's it. That's going to be accurate. What we've done in many previous occasions, though, every time we see row labels and column labels, let's change those, not by getting rid of them completely, but by going to the Design tab in the ribbon, choosing Report Layout, and then Outline or Tabular. Now, that's not a whole lot better, is it? Now, instead of column, what's a generic term for these? I guess we could say items or items sold. I'm going to say furniture item. That's a bit long maybe, but item might come up otherwise in a different term. So furniture item, that way. And instead of row, what's a generic term for these? How about outlet or sales method or something like that? I'll just use outlet. In other words, the method that we've sold them in. So that's going to help. Now, in the pivot table fields list, we're seeing furniture item, we're seeing outlet. That's going to be helpful. Filters says page 1. What's that? And what are the options as we click them here? Item 1, item 2, item 3. Those actually should be our regions. So if we make page 1 be a rows label, a rows area field, let's move outlet out of the way here. We can rename these. So item 1 really should be east. Now, I wish there were a faster way to do this, but at least we can do this. East and then Midwest. And then south. And then west. And that's going to make it easier to read. So we've got a pivot table that's actually pulling data from 4 separate worksheets. And you can do this, by the way, if you have 4 or 5 or whatever different workbooks as well. It's going to be a little bit trickier to do that, but it's the same general idea. In other words, you set up, as we did earlier, that we use the pivot table wizard, and then we start gathering data not from the same workbook by going to different sheets, but actually from the other open workbooks. They would have to be open, but you can consolidate data from different workbooks. And even though it would be better in the long run if these had the same layout, these different sheets, remember, they've got different layouts, but when we highlighted the data in each case here, we selected the labels on top and the labels down the side of this data in each case. Even though the layouts are different, we've got some data here. And so we can begin to start manipulating this as we move our fields around, as we do with pivot tables, to get different kinds of displays here. Brings out certain obvious situations. We don't sell bookcases in the South and the East. We don't sell chairs in the East, and so on. So we've got these kind of displays, and surely we could be using slicers here. We could introduce those just as we could, or just as we've seen previously. So there's any number of different things we can do with this concept, and it's definitely worth exploring. It gives us new power. It's very, very strange that you have to get into this feature in such an awkward way. Now, if you were to revisit Excel 2003, if you know a keystroke method of activating that pivot table, you could do that too. So something along the lines of Alt-DP, something along those lines. I forget what it would be. But you could do it that way instead of putting in the button. But I think the button's handy. It reminds us that we might want to use the feature. Now, you can keep the button there indefinitely or take it out and bring it back if you wish. It's just a question of how often you might be using this capability here. So I'm going to bring outlet into the rows area. So we got furniture item and outlet. And again, you can begin to see, zooming back here and doing the things we do with pivot tables, maybe getting rid of the subtotals, bringing them back when necessary, that sort of thing. There's a display. Data from different worksheets consolidated by way of pivot tables. So I think ultimately this is a great feature. It's widely overlooked, and in some cases you might think it would only work with data having the same layout. No, we proved that it didn't. So it's definitely worth exploring. Again, a quick reminder: how do we get this button in the quick access toolbar? And I'll do it slightly faster way this time. Right-click anywhere, quick access toolbar, and we can customize the quick access toolbar. It takes us right into Excel options. You can choose either commands not in the ribbon or all commands. Either one of these gives us the option for pivot table and pivot chart wizard. And as soon as you find it, you can then click add. Now, I did that earlier already, so can't do it a second time, but nevertheless, just add and OK, and it's there. Now, I want to switch back to the other workbook. And earlier, we were working with this data right here. Here, too, I think a more standard display. Again, nothing wrong with this by any means. And we've got conditional formatting here. I'm going to right-click here and go back to Value Field Settings, Show Values As, and then list simply no calculation, and change that number format back to be number. We didn't really need, no decimals needed here, possibly commas. There we go. Okay, and I still have conditional formatting in effect, so back to conditional formatting, clear the rules from this entire sheet. All right, let's imagine this kind of a scenario. Let's imagine for the moment, the data we're seeing here is for a single year. And the manager of the salespeople has decided that, okay, we're at the beginning of the year. Imagine we're in early January here, and we just got our totals for December. Here's your goal for next year or this year. We want you to improve by 10%, make it relatively straightforward. So we can create a pivot table here with brand new numbers that are 10% bigger than these. Or why not, to contrast the two, how about right next to these? Now, for some of these, we can do the math in our heads. Let's say if this is a 10% growth, then we would want to see, what, 16 greater, 176. So all these that end in 0, we can kind of do the math in our heads. But the other's a little bit tricky. Here's a 60, then next year you're going to do 66. Here's a 150, next year you're going to do 165. So let's add a new field here. Now remember, we could eventually replace this or simply have them side by side. So on the Analyze tab in the ribbon, Fields, Items, and Sets, Calculated Field. By the way, we could have done it by way of a right click as well too. Insert Calculated Field. Now we could give it a name. I'm going to call it Goal. If you do give this a name, you might have a little bit of an issue later about where you're going to use it in the worksheet, but in the pivot table itself, but it's okay for now. Formula equals what? So here are the names of our fields. Which field are we talking about here? These are the items sold field. So we sold this in this particular pivot table. The source data uses the term items for the number of items sold. And we can either insert the field or simply type it up above. The formula equal, and I'm just going to type it, equal items times, that's asterisk, 1.1. But let's stop here. What items are we dealing with? Well, you can see clothes washers. We can't have a tenth of a clothes washer or any of these items, as it looks like, of course. Can't have a fraction of those. So we'll want to make sure that our formula does rounding. So I will display this larger in a moment. Equal round, left parenthesis, items times 1.1, comma 0. We're going to round these calculations to the nearest whole number, right parentheses. And then, let me highlight that too, and I'll do a Control C, and then it ultimately paste that out on the worksheet. We can just click OK, and we're adding a new field. The wording will adjust too. So here's that 160 that I had mentioned. Here's the goal, 176. Okay, sum of goal, not a great phrase. We see it 4 times there. So, and by the way, let me paste the formula up here. Control V. That's the formula. Try that again. That's the formula. And I'll use a bigger font just so it gets displayed larger for the moment. There we are. So that's the formula that was written, the calculated formula for here. By the way, when you click on a cell, you don't see a formula here, and we never do in pivot tables, but that's the formula that these have been derived from, as we see it there. The previous item, or in this case, right there, the previous item, the 160 times 1.1, rounded to the nearest whole number. So sum of goal. Now, I had named the field, the calculated field goal. So if I type goal here, watch what happens. Pivot table field name already exists. I'll simply put a space behind it. There we go. And all the other corresponding fields just as well too. Now, nothing wrong with sum of items here, but let's say that represents current or last year. I'll just put in last year. And then clicking in the upper left corner, readjusting the column widths. Now, I'll have to move this out of the way eventually, but that's okay. Oops. There we go. And let me delete that and readjust. So we've got a more sensible display now. Although the wording here, because these words are larger, it looks kind of funny in one sense. A couple of things we could do here. What we could do is, first of all, if we switch the order of columns, if we switch the order in the columns area between product and values, as I drag this downward, notice what we're seeing now. This represents last year's totals right here, and then our 4 new goals that we have for the next year. So even if we adjust the column list, we're still going to have that oddity. So there we go. But what we can do here, there we go. We've got these side by side. Let's take these labels here and rotate them. From the Home tab, like this, and readjust the column lists again. Clicking in the upper left corner, then double clicking a boundary between column letters. So we've got our fork. So we got our 5 columns here for last year and our 5 columns for goal. You know, it might even be better here too, in this example here too, just for readability and slightly tidier back on the Home tab. Choose the option here, the angle option here for rotate text up. There we go. So we can see our data that way. Now, again, if you'd like to, we saw this in an earlier example too, you might want to intersperse these too. And so once we put last year below goal, this is in the values area, I'm going to drag the last year field below goal. Now we have an intermix again. Once again, too bad each time we do this, we have to click in the upper left corner, readjust the column widths, double click, just to make it look a little tighter. So now we're seeing goal this way, last year to the right, down here. The interspersing would take place if we move columns back and forth. The 2 fields in the columns area, now we see them this way. And it readjusts the labels again. So again, you'll come up with the best display. Now, keep in mind here too, if you simply wanted to have a pivot table, 2 separate ones, we can go that route again. Remember how easy it is. We can simply click here, go to the Analyze tab, and select the entire pivot table. And by the way, that does pick up the filters area as well here too. But by then pressing Control C, let's go right below it, Control V. A better approach could be clicking in the lower pivot table. Let's just take out in the lower pivot table last year's numbers. Just drag it off of here. And in the upper pivot table, take off goal. And we certainly could have put those side by side. That might have been slightly better, but I think you get the idea here. We've got 2 separate pivot tables. Could be a better way to display this information. What I'm going to do is simply move these up that way. And both of these are going to be simpler if we simply clean out the filters area. And then maybe delete these rows. So different ways, of course, to rearrange this information. Having more than one pivot table makes good sense sometimes. At other times, maybe it's not the most ideal display here. So 2 separate pivot tables, one showing our goal. This is where we're headed for next year, we hope. Total of 8809. This is last year or the current year, 8008. So different ways to get here by way of calculated fields. And think of other situations where you might want to put in data or numbers that you just can't get to. Don't overlook some of the many, many options as we suggested here. When you right click, remember, you can go to value field settings, show values as, and the many, many options in here, percent of row, percent of column, we saw those, and others here, difference from that. So here you don't really need formulas, but in a certain sense, it's similar to what we saw here with calculated fields. In an earlier example, we were showing you how to group data by date and time. And this particular worksheet, we actually explored time. But the one thing I mentioned that I want to follow up on is something about working with non-standard quarters. So in this particular pivot table, right now we're working based on time, but let's uncheck that and base it on date. A quick reminder that, and let's remove time completely here. Yeah, hours is active there too. Take out that. There we go. So this is what we would see if we're trying to analyze data by date and we have a date field. Remember, when you right click, you can immediately group these by days, months, quarters. But imagine, first of all, when we do quarters, and whether we're doing years along with it or not, we're going to see a display like this. Now, currently what we're seeing here is also data by date. Let's take that out of here. Instead of days, let's do these by years. That's going to make a bit more sense. There we are. Now, the current display, we mentioned this in the earlier course too, is column labels and row labels, but we're also seeing on the design tab here, under report layout, this is what we call the compact view, compact form, auto, we've got outline form, we can go back there and choose tabular form. Notice the difference here. Compact still, though, keeps those labels in place, column labels, row labels, which we really don't, I think most of the time, don't want. So I always suggest here, and I've been doing this in an earlier course too, more than today, and I did this a lot more in the earlier course than in this particular session, but tabular is the one that shows grid lines, outline doesn't, but neither of them compact it the way compact does. So that's if that's an advantage, it's taking up less horizontal space, but we've got these row labels, column labels here. So I'm going to undo and go back to this. Now, when we are looking at data like this, what if your quarters are not chronological? Here's the issue. This actually is January, February, March. What you're going to need to do over in the original source data is insert a new column and come up with the calculation here. So I'm going to call it FY quarter. We want a clear distinction between whatever name this field has and the word quarter. I mean, FY quarter is certainly similar. But how do we come up with the quarter here? What if the quarter system that you use, the fiscal year system that you use, is based on the same one that the federal government uses, where October is the first quarter? So here's a function you may or may not be familiar with, but it's called month. This pulls out the number 1 through 12, depending upon the month. So in the example here, we're about to see an 11. It's not formatted properly, so there it is, general format. That's the 11th month. That's what we get for month. Now, if it is the 11th month, it's going to be in the first quarter. So a function, you may not have seen this, it's easy to use. It's called choose. Could be a little bit lengthy, but not too bad. The choose function says, I've got some value here. Now, we know it's going to be 1 through 12. What we're about to do here is, show if this answer were 1. In other words, if it were January, what quarter would that be in? It would be in the second quarter. What if it were February? That's when the answer is 2. It's going to be second quarter also. And what if it were March? It's also in the second quarter. So what we're doing here, what the choose function is going to let us do is provide an answer for each of the 12 possibilities. So after the 3 2s, comma, 3 3s, then 3 4s, and then 3 1s, because when the month, for example, is 11, as it is here, our 11th entry out here, that's the 10th one, here's the 11th one, that's November. November's in the first quarter. So October, that's when month is 10, November when the month is 11, December the month is 12. All of these are going to be in the first quarter. So closing parenthesis there, we have these. So in our pivot table here, we have to do. Now, we still haven't come to the issue of years, but what I'm going to do in the pivot table is uncheck the box for quarters. And then clicking in the pivot table, I'm going to do a refresh. Remember, the source data has changed. Our source data has changed. And when I do this too, because I inserted from within, the pivot table will now recognize the new area. In other words, the expanded source data. So I'll click within the pivot table and press Alt F5. That's how we refresh. Remember, you can also do it from the Analyze tab. There's refresh as well. So we've got that. But now, in the pivot table field list, we've got this new entry called FY quarter. Now, let's plug this in now. And to make this simpler too, within the pivot table, we can only see a portion of it. I want to remove date. Those are the months. Let's take that out temporarily here. And bring in the fiscal year quarter. Now, we still have a problem though. And if we bring in months, we'll see it. But this is first, second, third quarter. But first quarter for 2012, in other words, which actual calendar year is that in? So as we start this here, I'm going to bring in quarters. I'm going to bring in date, which is actually months. And now we see what's happening here. Now, in a certain sense, that makes sense, but what we're going to have to do probably, and we might not have the time for it, but we're seeing what's playing out now. At least we got our quarter numbers are lining up with these. In other words, that's the second quarter is January, February, March. First quarter is October, November, December. But are we in the right year here now? So what we probably will have to do to make this even more conclusive here is figure out the actual maybe come up with a combination of fiscal year, quarter, and year at the same time. So without exactly solving the issue here, recognize that Excel is designed ideally to handle quarters on a chronological basis, not what we saw here. So you sometimes will have to go back to the source data. So there's so many different ways we can approach this. And the example here, although we haven't quite resolved it, and I didn't exactly mean to approach it that way, we can come up with different ways to display this data, whether it's your quarterly system or it's the chronological one. So Excel is not designed to pick up the unusual breakouts that we saw or that we're seeing in this example. That's why you have to put in that extra field. So this data here, let me zoom back a little bit. Even when we move these fields around, we've got a total of 68,755 total. So even though this data, as we're seeing it here, we're still seeing 68,755. When we bring in the date and we've got fiscal quarter here, we're still seeing that grand total. So the data is all here. I think the issue that's not quite resolved is even though this says 2012, think of this as fiscal 2012. So maybe the next thing to do is to relabel this, call that fiscal 2012, because it does represent data here. This is from 2012. And if we were to check out this data right here, for example, this number right here, which dates are these going to be from? In other words, if we double click here using our drill down capability, what we end up with is data here from 2012. So working with this data, a little bit complex. I think you can see though, we've got great possibilities with pivot tables to analyze this information. And as a reminder, when you work with information like this, when it's unorthodox or unusual, it's not to say that pivot table has all the answers at hand, but you've got amazing flexibility here in redesigning your source data, making the pivot table be refreshed to refer to it, And although this is an awkward situation here with fiscal quarters, you can come up with your own kinds of solutions as you work with this data. So we've seen lots of examples in this course about how to create pivot tables, different methods, different approaches to it. A method I only used a little bit, I want to bring back one more time as we do one more of these. A different worksheet. Actually, we had seen this one earlier, but a different way. In this particular workbook, it's an HR type list, not financially based exactly, except for the compensation column. Keep in mind that when you want to create a pivot table, if you are in a hurry and don't mind having the pivot table in a separate sheet, and usually that's just fine, many times by way of the insert tab, if you choose recommended pivot tables, you will see some choices here that are going to get you started pretty quickly here. What I'd like to see here is my departments down the left-hand side. As I look through the list here, don't see them at first, but eventually I do, one right there. So maybe that looks pretty good. I'll just double click it and we're off to the races. We've got something started here. May not be exactly what I want. I don't want the employee name there. I might want the building there, something like that. There it is. And I might want employee name instead of years. So there we are. In other words, we can get started pretty quickly if we know where we're going, and particularly when we know our data well. And that's always the issue that's in the background here. When it is your data, you've got a lot of strengths, you've got a lot of insight, and the pivot table concept is going to help you enormously in analyzing that information. Thank you all for watching. This is Dennis Taylor.